Imagine pouring your heart into your art, only to have your HOA call it a nuisance. What do you do when the system tries to silence your creativity? In today's video, we're diving into a story that proves how something as innocent as personal expression can spark a battle with the very system meant to protect us. This all began when a homeowner, passionate about his art, found himself at odds with the HOA's restrictive policies. What started as a small dispute over displaying art soon escalated into a full-blown confrontation that would change the entire community. The HOA, led by an overzealous president, was determined to shut down this homeowner's creative freedom, calling his work a nuisance. But what they didn't expect was that this would ignite a legal battle, a public stand, and a game-changing exhibit that turned the tide. Stick around as we explore how one individual's fight for artistic freedom not only shook up the HOA, but left a lasting mark on the community's rights and regulations. It all began in the suburban neighborhood of Meadowbrook, a community where most people kept to themselves, respecting the quiet rules set by the Homeowners Association, or HOA. For years, residents had adhered to the HOA's regulations, believing they were there to maintain the community's value and charm. But when the HOA president, Carol Green, introduced a new directive, things quickly spiraled out of control. The rule was simple but controversial. Homeowners were no longer allowed to display any artwork outside their homes, deeming it a potential eyesore and a nuisance to the neighborhood's aesthetic. This move was intended to curb what she described as distractions and unwanted attention, but it felt more like a blatant overreach. Among those affected was Michael Jensen, a passionate artist who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. His front yard, usually full of vibrant sculptures and painted canvases, had become a haven for his creative expression. What Carol Green and the HOA didn't know was that Michael wasn't your average homeowner. He wasn't just someone who enjoyed art for leisure. He had a background in law, specifically property rights. Michael had always prided himself on understanding the delicate balance between community rules and personal freedoms. And when he received the HOA's notice demanding that he remove his art, he knew this wasn't just about rules. It was about rights. At first, Michael was taken aback by the sudden enforcement of this rule. His sculptures weren't disruptive or dangerous. They were merely a reflection of his passion and an expression of his identity. His neighbors, who had long admired his artwork, were shocked as well. Yet, the HOA stood firm. Carol Green and the board argued that art could be a distraction, but it was clear to Michael that this was more about control than concern for aesthetics. He had seen similar aggressive behavior from the board before. Unnecessary fines for minor infractions, unreasonable restrictions, and the occasional unfriendly neighborhood meeting. The HOA had built a reputation for being overbearing, but this time it felt personal. This wasn't just about one man's art. It was a battle over freedom and expression. Michael could feel the weight of the situation. As an artist, his creations weren't just objects. They were messages, a means to share his perspective on the world. They were not merely decorations, but an intrinsic part of his identity. The community had come to expect his artwork, and many even looked forward to the changing displays in his front yard. Michael couldn't fathom how something as simple as artwork, something that brought life and vibrancy to his home, could now be viewed as a problem. He knew that simply complying wasn't an option. He couldn't just fold under the pressure of an HOA president who seemed to think she had the right to dictate every aspect of residents' lives. With a mixture of disbelief and determination, Michael decided to take action. He began to research not just the HOA's rules, but also property law, zoning ordinances, and any loopholes he could find. What started as a simple frustration soon turned into a mission to prove a point, not just for himself, but for his neighbors and anyone who believed in standing up for what's right. It all started on a quiet afternoon in the peaceful Meadowbrook community, a place where neighbors knew each other by name and lived in harmony under the watchful eye of the Homeowners Association, HOA. The HOA, a group of community members elected to oversee neighborhood regulations, had always enforced rules that residents begrudgingly followed, from lawn care to exterior paint colors. Most people didn't mind the rules. They were there to preserve the neighborhood's aesthetic and maintain property values. However, when the HOA president, Carol Green, announced a new policy that would prohibit homeowners from displaying any artwork outside their homes. The community's calm was shattered. Michael Jensen, a longtime resident of Meadowbrook, had always been an artist. For years, his front yard was filled with sculptures, painted wooden boards, and canvas artworks that transformed his property into an open-air gallery. His neighbors admired his creative expressions, often stopping by to chat about the meaning behind his pieces or to simply enjoy the bursts of color that contrasted with the otherwise uniform suburban landscape. To Michael, his art wasn't just decoration, it was an essential part of who he was. It connected him to his past, to his childhood memories of exploring museums with his parents, and to his desire to bring a little more beauty into the world. But this was all about to change. The new HOA rule, which was presented as a way to preserve the neighborhood's visual integrity, suddenly turned Michael's art into a problem. The letter he received from the HOA board informed him that he had 30 days to remove all artwork from his front yard or face fines. At first, Michael was stunned. How could something so personal, so harmless, be considered a violation of community standards? His neighbors were equally confused, and many reached out to him, expressing their support and confusion over the decision. But the HOA's message was clear. The art had to go. What Michael didn't realize at first was that the HOA president, Carol Green, had a long history of pushing the boundaries of her power. Under her leadership, the HOA had become notorious for its overreach, introducing petty fines for minor infractions like a stray mailbox leaning too far to the right or a single blade of grass out of place. Michael, however, was no stranger to rules or regulations. He had a background in property law. Before moving to Meadowbrook, he had worked as a legal consultant, advising clients on zoning laws, property rights, and land use policies. This knowledge, which he thought he had left behind, now became his weapon of choice. As Michael read through the letter, he couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice. He understood that the HOA had the right to enforce rules, but this felt different. This wasn't about the upkeep of the neighborhood. It was an infringement on his personal freedom. Determined not to let the HOA's overbearing policies dictate his life, Michael began to dig deeper into the rules and the legal standing of the HOA's actions. He started researching zoning amendments, city ordinances, and HOA regulations, knowing that he might find something that could turn the tide. He wasn't going to let this fight slide. Michael was prepared for the battle ahead, and the more he uncovered about the HOA's practices, the more he realized this wasn't just about art. It was about the power of individuals standing up to an overreaching authority. What he didn't expect was that this small dispute would spark a series of events that would change the dynamics of the entire community forever. As the days passed, the tension in Meadowbrook began to rise. The once peaceful neighborhood was now divided, with residents either siding with Michael or supporting the HOA's stance. Carol Green and the rest of the HOA board had made it clear that their new policy wasn't just a suggestion, it was a mandate. With no room for compromise, the HOA started issuing warnings to residents who continued to support Michael's right to display art. At first, the board sent letters, but soon the tone shifted. The penalties for not complying with the new rule were swift and severe. Fines were imposed, and notices were plastered on the front doors of those who dared to stand against the HOA's dictates. Michael, however, refused to back down. He had made it clear that he wasn't going to remove his art, believing it was a direct infringement on his right to express himself and his property rights. The HOA, with Carol at the helm, retaliated aggressively. Michael's property was the primary target, with the board sending repeated warnings demanding the removal of his sculptures. Each letter seemed to carry more threats, using legal jargon and referencing obscure clauses from the HOA's bylaws, trying to intimidate Michael into submission. But Michael, with his knowledge of property law, wasn't easily rattled. He fired back with carefully drafted responses, citing legal precedents and questioning the board's authority to enforce such a rule. Despite his best efforts, the board was unyielding. They accused him of being disruptive, of bringing chaos into the otherwise orderly community. The pressure on Michael grew, with some of his neighbors, who had initially supported him, starting to distance themselves. They feared the wrath of the HOA, which had long held sway over the neighborhood. The fines continued to accumulate, and the HOA's presence loomed larger. At one point, Carol Green herself visited Michael's property, hoping to intimidate him into compliance. When she arrived, Michael calmly explained his position, standing firm on his belief that the HOA was overstepping its boundaries. He referenced specific clauses from the HOA's governing documents, showing that the rules were vague and inconsistent. Carol, however, was dismissive, claiming that the HOA had the right to enforce any policy it deemed necessary for the community's well-being. But Michael wasn't alone in this fight. As his legal responses grew bolder, more and more residents began to see the bigger picture, the HOA's arbitrary control over their lives. Some of his neighbors, who had been quiet observers, now started voicing their discontent. A few even approached Michael, offering to join his fight, as they too had felt the brunt of the HOA's oppressive tactics. But Carol Green and the board were not about to back down. The more vocal the resistance became, the harsher their responses were. In one of the more dramatic moments, the HOA placed a lien on Michael's property due to unpaid fines, effectively putting his home in jeopardy. This move, however, was a tipping point. The community began to rally behind Michael. A petition was started, calling for a review of the HOA's policies and a reevaluation of the board's authority. What began as a personal dispute over a few sculptures was rapidly evolving into a full-blown confrontation between an individual's rights and the unchecked power of the HOA. The situation had escalated quickly. What was once a matter of a simple art display was now a battle for the very soul of the community. The HOA's actions had set the stage for a larger fight, one that would test the limits of authority and personal freedom. Michael had already decided that he wasn't going to back down, but what he didn't know was that the battle was far from over. With the HOA's relentless pursuit of fines and penalties, Michael knew he couldn't simply sit back and wait for the storm to pass. He had to do more. Armed with his legal knowledge, Michael decided to dig deeper, focusing on the HOA's past actions. What started as a simple attempt to challenge the current rule soon evolved into a full-scale investigation. He pored over every document he could find: bylaws, meeting minutes, previous fines, and even older policy changes. The more he searched, the more he uncovered, and what he found was nothing short of startling. As Michael sifted through the HOA's historical documents, he began to notice a troubling pattern: discrepancies in how rules were applied and a lack of transparency in the decision-making process. It wasn't just the art policy. The HOA had made numerous decisions that were legally questionable. For instance, they had frequently levied fines for minor infractions that weren't in line with the original governing documents, which were vague and poorly written. In fact, many of the rules enforced over the years had not been voted on by the community, as required by the HOA's own bylaws. Instead, they had been quietly passed during closed-door meetings and never brought to a vote. What struck Michael most was the discovery of a number of policy changes that appeared to serve the personal interests of the board members, particularly Carol Green. Several of these changes had gone unnoticed by the majority of residents, including an amendment to the parking rules that allowed board members to park in spaces that others couldn't use. It seemed like the HOA was not only misusing its power, but also making decisions that benefited a select few at the expense of the community. This was the ammunition Michael had been searching for. Determined to expose the board's corruption, Michael reached out to other residents who had been affected by the HOA's tactics. He was careful, though. He needed to be strategic. He couldn't afford to come across as a lone, disgruntled homeowner, so he began gathering support. One by one, he met with neighbors who had been fined or who had experienced unjust enforcement of the rules. Many of them were afraid to speak out, fearing retaliation from the HOA. But as Michael shared his findings, they began to see the truth. With a growing coalition of like-minded residents, Michael started drafting a comprehensive complaint against the HOA, one that included all the legal violations and inconsistencies he had uncovered. The revelation that the board had been acting outside of its legal authority, coupled with the potential violation of the rights of residents, was enough to spark a wave of outrage. But Michael didn't stop there. He knew that the HOA wouldn't just roll over. He needed to take the next step. He decided to consult with an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, hoping to build a strong legal case that would force the board to answer for its actions. As he prepared to take legal action, Michael's confidence grew. The discovery of the HOA's previous illegal decisions was the key turning point. What had once seemed like a personal battle over art had now turned into a fight for justice, one that threatened to expose the HOA's corruption and force the community to question the authority that had long gone unchallenged. The HOA may have underestimated him, but Michael was no longer a passive victim. He was a man on a mission to right the wrongs of his community, and he was about to turn the tables in a way that no one saw coming. With the evidence in hand and a growing coalition of supporters behind him, Michael knew it was time to take the fight to court. He filed a formal lawsuit against the HOA, citing violations of property rights, illegal decision-making processes, and a pattern of favoritism. The legal battle was fierce from the start, with the HOA's high-powered attorneys attempting to dismiss the case on technical grounds. But Michael was prepared. He had meticulously compiled documents, emails, and testimonies from fellow residents, all of which highlighted the HOA's misconduct. As the case progressed, the courtroom became a battleground where Michael's legal expertise and unwavering resolve were put to the test. Tensions rose as the HOA's lawyers attempted to discredit Michael's claims, but he stood firm, presenting his evidence with precision. Publicly, the case began to gain traction. Local news outlets picked up the story, casting a spotlight on the HOA's questionable practices. The community, once passive, now rallied behind Michael, many voicing their frustration with the board's actions. As the trial approached its climax, the once untouchable HOA president, Carol Green, found herself facing increasing pressure. The media frenzy surrounding the case, combined with the mounting public outcry, pushed the HOA to reconsider its stance. Michael's pursuit of justice was no longer just about one individual. It had become a symbol of standing up against institutional corruption. The court's ruling was a decisive blow to the HOA's oppressive practices. Michael emerged victorious, not just for himself, but for every resident who had been silenced by fear. The judge's decision was groundbreaking, forcing the HOA to overhaul its policies and establish a more transparent, fair system. The legal victory sent shockwaves through the community, inspiring other homeowners associations to review their practices. What had started as a battle over a simple art display had turned into a landmark case, setting a powerful precedent for how communities could challenge authority and demand accountability. Michael's story is a powerful reminder that one person can indeed spark massive change, even when facing seemingly insurmountable odds. His determination to uncover the truth and challenge an unjust system shows how knowledge, courage, and persistence can overcome corruption and inequality. It teaches us that even in the most tightly controlled environments, standing up for what's right can lead to meaningful reform. Michael's victory wasn't just about overturning an unfair decision. It was about empowering others to question authority and fight for justice, no matter how powerful the forces they face. If you found Michael's story inspiring and want to hear more incredible tales of everyday people challenging the odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. We dive into stories of courage, resilience, and the power of community, bringing you the most exciting and motivational content. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up against authority? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. And if you know someone who would love this story, don't forget to share it with them.